You know, it's a common misconception that the Battle of Stalingrad was primarily an urban fight, a battle for streets, for rooms, for rubble, but honestly that's only the final visible act of a much deeper, more systemic collapse. The truth is, Stalingrad was decided not in the ruins of the tractor factory, but out in the vast, empty steppes to its west. It was a battle of logistics betrayed by geography, of an army reaching for a symbolic victory, only to find its own logistical limits coiled like a noose around its advance. The Sixth Army did not starve and freeze because the Soviets surrounded it. It was surrounded because it was already starving and freezing. To understand Stalingrad is to understand a fundamental, often overlooked principle of warfare and survival, that will and firepower are meaningless beyond the radius of your supply lines. This isn't a story of a siege that began in November 1942. This is the story of a siege that began the moment the German advance bogged down in the city's outskirts 2 months prior. To understand the catastrophe, you must first understand the operational gamble. By late August 1942, the German summer offensive, Case Blue, had stretched over 300 miles from its starting positions. Its objective was the oil fields of the Caucasus, a resource-critical prize. Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River, was a secondary objective, a flank guard. But it bore the name of Stalin, and as Soviet resistance solidified, Hitler and the commander of Army Group B, General Vikes, made a critical pivot. They decided to take the city, believing its fall would break Soviet morale and secure the northern flank. This was the first fatal compromise, the diversion of massive force from the main, resource-oriented objective to a symbolic one. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous staff officer but an untested commander in such a crucible, was ordered to take the city. The logistics tail, already strained to its breaking point across the steppe, now had to funnel everything into a narrow, dense urban corridor. The rails were different gauges, trucks broke down, fuel and ammunition took precedence. Winter clothing, medical, supplies, and food were left in rear depots. The assumption was one of victory before winter, a catastrophic failure of imagination and intelligence. The city did not lend itself to the doctrine of maneuver warfare. When the Sixth Army reached Stalingrad, it encountered a topography that, really, just neutralized its strengths. The Soviet 62nd Army, under Chuikov, did not merely defend the city, they used its unique layout as a weapon. Stalingrad was not a dense European city block. It was a long, narrow ribbon of industry and housing stretching nearly 20 miles along the western bank of the Volga. Chuikov understood that German superiority in air power, artillery and combined arms was most effective in open ground and deep encirclements, so he compressed the front lines to what he called hugging distance, often within 50 meters of the enemy. This rendered German artillery and Stuka dive bombers impotent for fear of hitting their own troops. It forced every engagement into the realm of small unit infantry combat, a brutal, close-quarter struggle where Soviet familiarity with the terrain and sheer desperation could balance the scales. The battle devolved into what German soldiers called Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. It was a battle of platoons and squads, of sappers and snipers, fought in a landscape of steel, concrete, and shattered brick. Here, the German logistical advantage in heavy munitions was irrelevant. What mattered was the supply of grenades, submachine gun ammunition, and morphine. And in this, the Soviets, with the Volga at their backs, could sustain a trickle of supply that kept them just barely alive. The air bridge was a logistical fantasy from its inception. When Operation Uranus, the Soviet encirclement, was launched on November 19th, it did not strike a robust, supplied army. It cut off a force already on a logistical starvation diet. The German High Command's promise to supply the Sixth Army by air was not just optimistic, it was a mathematical impossibility. The trapped force required a minimum of 750 tons of supplies per day to survive and fight. The absolute maximum capacity of the Luftwaffe, under ideal conditions with all its dedicated transport aircraft operational, was perhaps 300 tons. Conditions were not ideal, they were atrocious. The Soviets massed hundreds of anti-aircraft guns around the fortress, flying conditions were poor, and the airfields within the pocket were under constant artillery fire. On the best days, perhaps 100 tons arrived. Most days, far less. The aircraft that did land took off again filled with wounded, a humanitarian choice that further doomed the fighting men, as those flights carried out capacity that could have brought in fuel or ammunition. The airlift became a slow-motion verdict. It systematically consumed the Luftwaffe's transport fleet for no strategic gain, and it condemned the Sixth Army to a death by attrition. This was the ultimate lesson in the physics of supply promises cannot move tons of materiel, only infrastructure can. The cold was a combatant, and it chose its side deliberately. We speak of the Russian winter as if it were a surprise guest. It was not. The German High Command had the meteorological reports. They chose to ignore them. The Soviet High Command, however, planned for it. As the Sixth Army's men huddled in their summer tunics, burning furniture and oil drums, Soviet soldiers were already being issued their felt boots, quilted jackets, and white camouflage suits. The Soviet T-34 tanks arrived from factories east of the Urals with winter-grade oils and lubricants. German tanks and trucks with standard oils would not start without hours of laborious fire building beneath their engines, making them vulnerable and immobile. Frostbite was not merely a medical condition, it was a force multiplier. A soldier who cannot feel his fingers cannot clean his weapon, operate a radio, or effectively throw a grenade. The cold weaponized the environment in favor of the side that had prepared for it as a matter of course. It was a failure not of weather, but of strategic preparedness, a refusal to accept the environmental reality of the theater of operations. The surrender was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new calculus. The capitulation of Field Marshal Paulus on January 31, 1943, is often seen as the finale, but its true impact was in the irreversible shift it created in the strategic minds of both sides. For the Germans, the concept of fortresses, holding encircled cities at all costs, became a broken doctrine, though one Hitler would still disastrously attempt. For the Soviets, Stalingrad proved the viability of deep operational art, of using strategic depth to draw an enemy in, let him exhaust himself, and then strike not at his front, but at the fragile seams of his advance. The battle also created a new grim currency, the prisoner of war. Of the approximately 91,000 Germans taken at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home a decade later. Their fate was a direct consequence of the German army's own logistical failure. The Soviets, themselves starving and overstretched, had no capacity to care for them. This outcome speaks to a harsh survivalist truth. In a total collapse of systems, the captive is at the mercy of the captor's resources, and those are always allocated first to one's own. Stalingrad endures not as a lesson in street fighting, though that was its visible horror. It endures as the definitive case study in the tyranny of logistics. It is about the distance a truck can travel on a muddy road, the caloric intake of a soldier, the freezing point of engine oil, and the tragic weight of a symbol over substance. It reminds us that survival, whether of an individual or an army, is not determined at the moment of crisis, but in the preparations, assumptions, and honest assessments made long before. The battle was lost in conference rooms and supply depots hundreds of miles away, months before the last German soldier in the Kessel laid down his frozen rifle. We study it not for the spectacle of destruction but to see, with brutal clarity, how the most professional force can be brought low, not by a lack of courage, but by a failure to respect the immutable laws of supply, distance, and winter. If you value this kind of grounded, in-depth analysis that looks beyond the battle map to the underlying systems and failures, then you belong here. Consider subscribing to War Machiner. If you found this perspective valuable, please share it with others who seek a deeper understanding of history's hardest lessons.